I never thought I'd be sleeping in my parents' garage at 32, especially not after paying off their entire mortgage. The irony wasn't lost on me as I lay on the old fold-out cot, staring at the ceiling where expensive cars used to be parked. Now it stored broken dreams and a daughter they'd rather forget. Sarah. My mother's sharp voice cut through the thin walls. The bathroom needs cleaning before your sister's dinner party tonight. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of musty garage air. My sister Olivia, the golden child, had just landed a job at Maxwell Industries, one of the largest tech companies in the country. Of course, they were throwing her a celebration dinner. "Coming, Mom," I called back, swinging my legs off the cot. The concrete floor was cold against my bare feet. They hadn't bothered to put down carpeting when they converted my old bedroom into Olivia's home office 3 months ago. 6 months earlier, I had transferred $250,000 to their account to pay off their mortgage. They were about to lose the house. The same house I'd grown up in, the same house where my father had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, where my mother had once braided my hair before school. I couldn't bear to see them lose it. "The garage is good enough for you," my mother had sneered when I asked if I could move back home temporarily after my apartment building was sold for redevelopment. "We need to keep the guest room free for when Olivia visits." Olivia, who lived 20 minutes away in a luxury apartment. Olivia, who had never contributed a penny to family expenses. Olivia, who was about to be celebrated while I scrubbed toilets. I grabbed my cleaning supplies from the corner of the garage where I kept my meager belongings. The past 3 months had been a masterclass in swallowing my pride. Every morning, I'd wake up early to avoid being seen by the neighbors, sneak into the house through the side door, and get ready for work in the downstairs bathroom, the one reserved for the help. My parents had no idea what I actually did for a living. They'd stopped asking years ago, assuming I was still working that dead-end job at a consulting firm. If only they knew. As I cleaned the bathroom, I could hear my mother in the kitchen, talking excitedly on the phone about tonight's dinner. "Yes, 15 people. Olivia's new boss is coming. No, just family and important guest. With Sarah? She'll help serve." I gripped the toilet brush tighter, remembering the day I'd transferred the mortgage payment. There had been no thank you, no acknowledgement. Instead, my father had looked at the bank statement and said, "Well, it's about time you contributed something to this family." The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the bathroom window, I caught a glimpse of catering vans pulling up. The celebration was beginning. "Sarah." My mother's voice again. "Go change into something presentable. And use the garage entrance. The guests will be coming through the front door." I changed into a simple black dress, designer, though my mother would never recognize the subtle label. As I was pinning up my hair, my phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, my CEO. "Board meeting moved to Thursday. By the way, Maxwell Industries acquisition paperwork is ready for your signature." I smiled faintly at the message, then turned my phone off. Tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about family, even if they didn't consider me part of it anymore. The guests arrived in waves of expensive perfume and tailored suits. I recognized most of them family friends who used to pinch my cheeks at birthday parties but now looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. My Aunt Patricia, dripping in jewelry, barely nodded as I took her coat. Then Olivia made her entrance, radiant in a red designer dress, her arm linked with our father's. Behind them walked a tall man in an impeccable suit, James Maxwell himself, CEO of Maxwell Industries. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral as I stood in the background. "Everyone," my father announced, beaming with pride, "please welcome my daughter Olivia, Maxwell Industries' new junior marketing director." Applause filled the room. My mother wiped away tears of joy. I continued arranging appetizers on silver trays. "Such a beautiful family," James Maxwell commented, his eyes scanning the room. "Though I was told you had 2 daughters?" My father's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh yes, Sarah is. Sarah, come here for a moment." I approached carefully, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Yes, Dad. This is Sarah, our other daughter," he said quickly. "Sarah, this is Mr. Maxwell." James reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card holder. "Please call me James. Here's my card. I like to maintain personal connections with all my employees' families." My father's forced smile grew more strained as James handed out his business cards to everyone. I accepted mine with a quiet thank you, knowing exactly what it said. Oh, before I forget, James continued, I should probably give you my boss's card too. She's quite particular about protocol. He handed another card to my father, who accepted it automatically. I watched as his eyes scanned the elegant cardstock, then froze. The fork he'd been holding clattered to the floor. There, in embossed silver letters, was my name. CEO of Phoenix Enterprises, the parent company that had just acquired Maxwell Industries. The room fell silent as my father stared at the card, then at me, his face draining of color. My mother hurried over, peering at the card over his shoulder. Her gasp was audible. But that's impossible, she whispered. Sarah's just a what, Mom? I asked softly, setting down the tray of appetizers. Just the daughter you made sleep in the garage? Just the failure who paid off your mortgage? James Maxwell cleared his throat. Actually, Sarah's my boss. Has been for the past 5 years. Phoenix Enterprises acquired Maxwell Industries last week, though we kept it quiet until the paperwork was finalized. Olivia, who had been preening in her new position, suddenly looked like she might faint. You own Maxwell Industries? Among other companies, I replied calmly. Though I have to say the junior marketing director position might need to be re-evaluated during the restructuring. The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on me, the daughter they'd banished to the garage, the failure they'd mocked, the servant they'd expected to wait on them tonight. For the first time they were seeing me clearly, and I could tell they were terrified of what they saw. But this was just the beginning. They had no idea what was coming next. The crystal glasses clinked with uncomfortable tension as the guests shifted in their seats around the dining table. My mother had insisted we proceed with dinner, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But nothing was normal anymore. The careful hierarchy of their world had been shattered the moment my business card landed in my father's trembling hands. I sat at the far end of the table, no longer in the kitchen where they'd planned to have me serve, but still separated from the important guests. James Maxwell, however, had insisted on sitting next to me, much to my mother's poorly concealed distress. Sarah, my father's voice cracked slightly as he attempted to take control of the situation. Why didn't you tell us about any of this? I took a slow sip of wine, an expensive vintage from my own cellar that I'd brought as a gift, which they'd earlier dismissed as probably cheap. You never asked, I replied simply. In fact, the last time I tried to tell you about my work, you said, and I quote, "Nobody cares about your little consulting job." Olivia, who had barely touched her food, spoke up. But Phoenix Enterprises is worth billions. They're one of the largest holding companies in the country. How could you possibly be successful? I finished for her. Be wealthy, be powerful. It's amazing what one can accomplish when they're consistently underestimated and ignored. My mother's hand shook as she reached for her water glass. But the garage. Why would you stay in the garage if you're so successful? I wanted to see if there was any limit to how poorly you'd treat me, I said quietly. Apparently there wasn't. The truth hung heavy in the air. Every demand they'd made, every insult they'd thrown, every time they'd made me feel small, it all came rushing back, but now with a different weight. James cleared his throat. Sarah's being modest, actually. Phoenix Enterprises doesn't just own Maxwell Industries. We've acquired 7 Fortune 500 companies in the past year alone. Your daughter is one of the most influential CEOs in the country. My Aunt Patricia choked on her wine. She'd been one of the loudest voices mocking my career choices over the years. But the mortgage payment, my father said weakly. You made such a big deal about helping us. I transferred that money from my personal checking account, I explained. It was less than what I spend on office supplies in a month. I helped because that's what family is supposed to do. Something this family seems to have forgotten. Olivia's face had turned an interesting shade of pale. My job, you're not really going to reevaluate your position? I raised an eyebrow. Actually, I am. Maxwell Industries isn't a place for nepotism anymore. Everyone will be evaluated based on their merit and contribution to the company. You can't do this. My mother's voice rose slightly. We're family. Family. I set down my fork, looking her directly in the eye. Was I family when you made me sleep in the garage? Was I family when you turned my bedroom into Olivia's home office? Was I family when you had me serve drinks to your guests? The silence that followed was deafening. I think, James said, standing up, this might be a good time for me to leave. Sarah, I'll see you at the board meeting on Thursday. I nodded, watching as the other guests quickly made their excuses and fled. Soon it was just our family left in the dining room, surrounded by half-eaten meals and shattered illusions. Why didn't you just tell us? My father finally asked, his voice small. Would it have changed how you treated me? I asked. Would you have respected me more if you knew I was rich? Because that's not respect, Dad. That's opportunism. I stood up, smoothing my dress. I've purchased the property next door. I'm having the house demolished to build my new office complex. The zoning permits were approved last week. My mother's face went white. But that's the Hendersons' old house. The noise, the construction, it'll ruin our property value. Yes, I agreed. It probably will. Isn't it funny how money works? How it can build things up or tear them down? Sarah, please, Olivia suddenly burst out. I'm sorry, okay? We're all sorry. We didn't know. That's the problem, I cut her off. You didn't need to know I was successful to treat me with basic dignity. You didn't need to know I was powerful to show me basic respect. I walked to the garage to collect my things. My father followed me, hovering in the doorway. The cot, he said, looking at the shabby bed where his millionaire daughter had been sleeping. We made you sleep on a cot. Yes, I said, picking up my designer overnight bag, the one they'd assumed was fake. You did. We can't change the past, he said quietly. But maybe we can try to fix things? I turned to face him. You know what's interesting, Dad? I built my entire empire while you were busy dismissing me. Every company I acquired, every deal I closed, every success I celebrated, I did it all without you. And I'll continue to do so. What are you saying? I'm saying that I don't need to fix things with you. I don't need anything from you. For the first time, you're the ones who need something from me. I walked past him, through the house where my mother and Olivia sat in stunned silence, and out the front door. My driver was waiting with my car. Not the modest sedan I usually took to keep up appearances, but the Bentley I actually owned. The office, Miss Harrison? He asked, opening the door. No, I said, looking back at the house one last time. Take me home. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. True to my word, the Henderson house was demolished and construction began on my new office complex. The noise was constant, starting precisely at 7 a.m. every morning, right when my parents usually enjoyed their morning coffee on the patio. Olivia was reassigned to an entry-level position at Maxwell Industries, based on her actual qualifications. She lasted 3 days before quitting, unable to handle having to work her way up like everyone else. My mother tried calling several times, her messages evolving from demands to pleas. Sarah, please, the construction is driving us crazy. Sarah, we can work this out. Sarah, we're your parents, you can't just ignore us. But I could, and I did. 1 month after the dinner party, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. My father, looking older than I'd ever seen him, sat nervously in my waiting room. Your office is bigger than our house, he observed as I led him into my private conference room. That's not difficult, I replied. Would you like some coffee? He shook his head, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. It was the mortgage statement from when I'd paid off their house. I didn't understand then, he said quietly. You gave us $250,000 and we didn't even say thank you. Instead, we made you sleep in the garage. Yes, I said, simply waiting. I've been thinking about what you said about not needing to know someone is successful to treat them with dignity. He looked down at his hands. We failed you, Sarah. Not just as parents but as human beings. You did, I agreed. I'm not here to ask for anything, he continued. I needed you to know that I understand now. And I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I studied him for a long moment. The construction next door will continue for at least another year. He nodded. We deserve that. And Olivia will need to find her own way in her career. Yes. And things will never go back to how they were before. He stood up slowly. I know. But maybe they can be better? Different but better. I thought about the little girl who used to ride her bike in the driveway, who just wanted her parents to be proud of her. She was gone now, replaced by a woman who had built an empire out of spite and success out of silence. Different, I agreed finally. We can try different. As my father left, I looked out my office window at the construction site next door. The old Henderson house was completely gone now, making way for something new. Sometimes I realized that's what it takes, tearing everything down to build something better. My phone buzzed with a message from James Maxwell. Board meeting in 5 minutes. By the way, your sister just applied for another position under a different name. I smiled, typing back, rejection letter already drafted. Some things would never change, but some things had changed forever. The daughter they'd banished to the garage now had the power to reshape their entire world. And while forgiveness might be possible, forgetting never would be. I gathered my papers for the board meeting, pausing briefly to look at the business card that had started it all. Sarah Harrison, CEO, Phoenix Enterprises. The garage might have been good enough for me then, but now? Now I had built myself a tower of glass and steel, a monument to every time they tried to make me feel small. And that was worth more than any family dinner could ever be.
I never planned to reveal my true identity to my family. For 3 years, I worked as a housekeeper at the Richardson Grand Hotel, our family's pride and joy, while secretly being the CEO of Lux Global Hotels, the third largest hotel chain in the world. But family has a way of pushing you past your limits, especially when they think you're beneath them. My name is Grace Chen, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the best way to teach humility is to let people reveal their own arrogance. The Richardson Grand had been in our family for 2 generations. My Uncle Thomas inherited it from my grandfather, turning it from a modest local establishment into a respectable regional hotel. But it was struggling in today's market, falling behind modern hospitality trends and accumulating debt that my uncle refused to acknowledge. I remember the day I made the decision to work there. I had just finished a meeting with my executive team at Lux Global, discussing potential acquisitions in the Northeast region. The Richardson Grand's name came up on our target list, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The Richardson family seems resistant to selling, my CFO reported. They're drowning in debt but won't admit it. 6 months, maybe a year before they're forced to sell at a fraction of their current value. I couldn't let that happen, not to my family's legacy, even if they had no idea who I really was, even if they thought I was just the quiet niece who never amounted to much. So I did what any secret CEO would do. I applied for a job as a housekeeper. Why would you want to work here? HR had asked, puzzled by my application. Your degree is from Cornell's hotel school. I believe in starting from the ground up, I replied, knowing they wouldn't understand the full truth of those words. For 3 years, I watched and learned. I cleaned rooms, changed sheets, and quietly observed everything that was wrong with the hotel's operations, all while running my own billion-dollar company remotely during my breaks and after hours. My cousin Bradley, Uncle Thomas's son and the hotel's current manager, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my position. Grace, the bathroom in 306 needs attention. He'd call across the lobby, making sure guests could hear him ordering around his own cousin. Try not to take all day this time. I did every task perfectly, gathering information that would later prove invaluable. Every leaking pipe, every outdated system, every guest complaint. I documented it all, not that anyone noticed. They were too busy looking down their noses at the quiet housekeeper who kept to herself. That all changed last Tuesday at the monthly family business meeting. I usually wasn't invited, but this time Bradley had a special reason for wanting me there. The family gathered in the hotel's grand conference room, all mahogany panels and crystal chandeliers that had seen better days. Uncle Thomas sat at the head of the table, his wife Margaret beside him. Bradley stood at the front, practically bouncing with excitement as he prepared to make his announcement. As you all know, he began, straightening his designer tie, the hotel industry is evolving. We need to modernize to compete with the big chains. He clicked to the next slide in his presentation. That's why I've developed a comprehensive rebranding strategy. I nearly choked on my water. The strategy he was presenting was an almost exact copy of a successful initiative I had implemented at Lux Global 2 years ago. He must have found it in some industry publication and claimed it as his own. We'll need to terminate some of our less essential staff, Bradley continued, his eyes finding mine with a smirk. Starting with outdated positions like full-time housekeepers. We'll outsource to a cleaning service instead. The room fell silent. Everyone knew he was talking about me. Now Bradley, Aunt Margaret said with false concern. Grace is family. Perhaps we could find her another position. In the laundry, perhaps. I sat quietly, watching my cousin's plan unfold. 3 years of his subtle jabs and not-so-subtle humiliation had led to this moment. He wanted to fire me in front of the entire family, to prove once and for all that he was the successful one, the worthy heir to the Richardson Grand. Actually, Bradley said, puffing up with self-importance, I've already arranged everything. The new cleaning service starts next week. He turned to me with a thin smile. Grace, consider this your official notice. We'll need your uniform returned by Friday. I could have revealed everything right then. Could have pulled out my phone and shown him the Lux Global company profile with my picture and CEO title. Could have mentioned that my breaks were actually spent running a company with over 200 hotels worldwide. Instead, I stood up slowly, smoothed my housekeeper's uniform, and smiled. Of course, Bradley, I understand completely. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and congratulations on the rebranding strategy. It worked wonderfully when Lux Global implemented it 2 years ago. I left them wondering how a housekeeper knew that detail, walking away to the sound of Bradley's spluttering excuses about his original plan. What they didn't know was that in my 3 years of cleaning rooms and observing operations, I had compiled a comprehensive analysis of everything wrong with the Richardson Grand. Every violation of health codes, every shortcut in maintenance, every instance of Bradley fudging the books to hide his expensive mistakes. And tomorrow, the CEO of Lux Global Hotels had a scheduled inspection of the property. They just didn't know that the CEO was me. I spent that evening in my small apartment above the local coffee shop, finalizing the details of what would happen next. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members, some expressing concern about my firing, others warning me not to make a scene. I ignored them all. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my executive team at Lux Global. Proceed with Operation Richardson tomorrow as planned, and make sure Bradley's there for the entire inspection. It's time he learned what real hotel management looks like. As I clicked send, I couldn't help but smile, thinking about tomorrow. Bradley always said I needed to learn my place in the hotel business. He was about to find out exactly what that place was. The next morning, I arrived at the Richardson Grand exactly at 9 a.m., but not in my usual housekeeper's uniform. Instead, I wore a tailored charcoal suit from my other life, my CEO wardrobe that had been hanging unused in my apartment for 3 years. My heels clicked against the marble lobby floor as I walked in, turning heads of guests and staff alike. Excuse me, miss, Bradley's voice called out from behind the front desk. Can I help you find? His voice trailed off as I turned around. Grace? What are you? Why are you dressed like that? Good morning, Bradley, I said calmly. I believe you're expecting the CEO of Lux Global Hotels today. His face contorted in confusion. Yes, but you need to leave. We have an important inspection today, and I can't have you causing a scene about your termination. The elevator dinged and my executive team stepped out. Thomas Wright, my CFO, Sarah Martinez, our head of operations, and Michael Chang, our chief legal officer. All people who had been running Lux Global with me via video calls and late-night meetings for the past 3 years. Mrs. Chen, Thomas said, walking over with a professional nod. The preliminary reports you requested are ready for review. Bradley's face went pale. Mrs. Chen, what's going on here? Perhaps we should move this discussion to the conference room, I suggested. And Bradley, please call Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret. They'll want to be here for this. 30 minutes later, my family sat in the same conference room where they'd fired me yesterday, but the power dynamic had shifted dramatically. My executive team lined one side of the table, while the Richardson family sat opposite, looking like they'd seen a ghost. Let me make this clear, I began, standing at the head of the table where Uncle Thomas usually sat. For the past 3 years, while working as a housekeeper here, I've also been serving as the CEO of Lux Global Hotels. Every break I took wasn't spent slacking off, as Bradley often claimed, but running a company with over 200 properties worldwide. That's impossible, Aunt Margaret whispered. You're just a maid? I finished for her. That's exactly why this worked so perfectly. You were also convinced of my insignificance that none of you ever bothered to Google my name or question why a Cornell graduate would choose to work as a housekeeper. I opened my laptop and projected a series of documents onto the screen. During my time here, I've documented every violation of health codes, every instance of deferred maintenance, and every questionable accounting practice. I glanced at Bradley, who suddenly found the table very interesting, including the $500,000 renovation budget that actually went to covering gambling debts. Uncle Thomas's head snapped toward his son. Bradley, is this true? Dad, I can explain. I continued before he could spin another lie. The Richardson Grand is 3 months away from bankruptcy. Your reputation in the industry is deteriorating, and your staff turnover rate is nearly 80% annually. In short, this hotel is failing. The room fell silent. 3 years of hard truths laid bare in one moment. Why? Uncle Thomas finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why work as a housekeeper if you're really who you say you are? I sat down, softening my tone. Because this hotel is our family's legacy. Grandfather built it from nothing. I couldn't bear to see it fail. I needed to understand exactly what was wrong before I could help fix it. Fix it? Bradley scoffed, finding his voice again. We don't need your help, and I still don't believe you're really. Sarah slid a folder across the table. Mrs. Chen's credentials, press coverage, and company documentation. Feel free to verify everything. As my family flipped through the papers, their faces cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally understanding, I laid out their options. Lux Global is prepared to make an offer to purchase the Richardson Grand. A very generous offer considering its current financial state. We'll maintain the family name and history, but bring it up to modern standards. Or what? Uncle Thomas asked. Or I walk away, both as a housekeeper and as a potential buyer. But I should warn you, the next company that offers to buy this hotel won't care about preserving your legacy. They'll knock it down and build something new. Aunt Margaret, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. All those times we looked down on you, treated you like you were beneath us. You could have said something. Would you have believed me? I asked quietly. Or would you have dismissed it as the desperate lies of just a maid? The silence that followed was answer enough. I stood up, gathering my papers. I'll give you 24 hours to decide. If you accept our offer, the Richardson Grand will become the flagship property of our new Classic Hotels division. If not, I shrugged. I hear the property developers are offering a fair price for the land. As I turned to leave, Bradley's voice stopped me. Wait. The rebranding strategy I presented yesterday was a copy of my initiative from 2 years ago. Yes, I know. Next time you decide to plagiarize someone's work, Bradley, make sure they're not in the room. The next 24 hours were tense. My phone remained silent as my family processed everything they'd learned. I spent the time in my small apartment, finally able to work openly on my laptop without hiding my CEO identity. At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, Uncle Thomas called. We accept, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. But Grace, I need to know, can you forgive us? I thought about all the times they dismissed me, looked down on me, treated me as less than family. But I also thought about my grandfather, who taught me that true leadership isn't about revenge. It's about making things better. I'm not interested in forgiveness, Uncle Thomas. I'm interested in making the Richardson Grand great again. Are you ready to help me do that? The transformation of the hotel took 6 months. Bradley was reassigned to our property in Miami, starting as an assistant manager, where he could learn the business properly. Uncle Thomas retired but stayed on as a consultant, his decades of experience finally being put to good use without the stress of running the whole operation. The Richardson Grand became our most successful classic property, a perfect blend of historic charm and modern efficiency. The staff turnover rate dropped to 15%, and our guest satisfaction scores soared. 1 year after the revelation, I stood in the newly renovated lobby, watching guests check in at the gleaming front desk. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, restored to their former glory. A new plaque hung on the wall, telling the story of how my grandfather started the hotel with nothing but a dream and determination. Aunt Margaret appeared beside me, looking around with pride. You know, Grace, I think I finally understand why you did it this way. Oh, I turned to her, curious. You could have bought the hotel outright 3 years ago, could have forced us out. Instead, you chose to understand it from the ground up, to learn every detail, every problem, every possibility for improvement. I smiled. The best leaders don't just give orders, Aunt Margaret. They understand every aspect of their business, from changing sheets to managing millions. Your grandfather would be proud, she said softly, not just of saving the hotel, but of how you did it. As I watched another happy family check in, I thought about everything that had happened. The 3 years of being underestimated, of cleaning rooms while running a global company, of biting my tongue through countless family meetings. Had it been worth it? The hotel's new rating had just come in that morning, 5 stars, the highest possible score. Our occupancy rate was at 95%, and we had a waiting list for premium rooms. The staff moved through the lobby with pride and purpose, each one properly trained and fairly compensated. But more importantly, my family had learned valuable lessons about humility, respect, and true leadership. Bradley was actually doing well in Miami. Having finally understood that success comes from hard work and integrity, not arrogance and shortcuts. Yes, it had been worth it. I straightened my suit jacket and headed to my office, the same room where Bradley had once summoned me to clean bathrooms. Now it was command central for both the Richardson Grand and my ongoing duties as CEO of Lux Global. On my desk sat a framed photo of my grandfather standing proudly in front of his newly opened hotel. Next to it was my old housekeeper's uniform, preserved in a shadow box with a small plaque that read, "Never forget where you started." And I never would, because sometimes the best way to lead isn't from above, but from within. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should watch most carefully. And sometimes, just sometimes, the maid turning down your bed is actually the CEO making sure everything is perfect. As for me, I still occasionally put on a housekeeper's uniform and spend a day working alongside our staff. It keeps me grounded, keeps me connected to what matters most in this business, the small details that make a hotel feel like home. After all, you never know who might be watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to reveal their true worth. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the gallery's Victorian windows. I stood in the middle of what my mother-in-law had called that worthless old junk shop, surrounded by paintings, sculptures, and artifacts that my grandfather-in-law, James Montgomery, had collected over his 6 decades of world travel. "At least the building is structurally sound," my husband Tom said, trying to be optimistic as he examined the old hardwood floors. "Maybe we could sell it to a developer?" I ran my hand along an ornate frame, feeling the intricate carving beneath years of dust. "Not yet," I said quietly. "Your grandfather left this to us for a reason. Let's at least try to understand what he built here." My name is Emma Chen Montgomery, and 2 weeks ago, I inherited what the family considered the booby prize in James Montgomery's will. While my brother-in-law Richard received the family mansion and investment portfolio, and my sister-in-law got the vacation properties, I was left the Montgomery Gallery of Fine Arts, a 3-story Victorian building in a small town that had seen better days. A fitting inheritance for the art history major, my mother-in-law Margaret had sneered at the will, reading, "Worthless art for someone with a worthless degree." What they didn't know was that during the last year of his life, I was the only one who regularly visited James. While the rest of the family was busy managing their portfolios and social calendars, I spent afternoons with him in this gallery, listening to stories about his collections. But he never gave me a complete inventory, never fully explained what treasures might be hidden among what looked like a lifetime of eclectic collecting. Grandpa James had an eye for the unusual, I told Tom as we explored the dusty rooms. He never collected the obvious pieces. He used to say that true value isn't always visible at first glance. Tom nodded, but I could tell he was distracted, probably thinking about the $1 million property portfolio his brother had inherited. The Montgomery family fortune had been built on real estate and smart investments, not art. To them, this gallery was just an old man's expensive hobby. I pulled out my laptop and the small notebook I'd used to record James's stories during our visits. "Let's start with the main gallery," I said, beginning to catalog the collection. My art history background and museum internships had taught me the importance of proper documentation. The first floor contained mainly paintings, landscapes, portraits, and abstract works from various periods. Many were good. Some were excellent, but nothing seemed extraordinary at first glance. But then I noticed something about a small landscape in a corner. "Tom, look at this signature," I called him over. "The style, the brushwork. This looks like an early Monet, but it's signed M. Claude. Is that important?" Monet's full name was Oscar Claude Monet. He sometimes signed early works as Claude. I carefully examined the canvas backing the age of the frame. My hands started to tremble. This could be an unknown early work. We need an expert to verify it. Tom looked more interested now. How much will that be worth? If it's authentic? Millions. I was already taking detailed photographs. But more importantly, if Grandpa James had one piece like this, there might be more. Tom finished, finally understanding. We spent the next week doing a preliminary inventory. The more I looked, the more I found pieces that needed expert evaluation. A small bronze sculpture that bore striking similarities to Rodin's early work. A collection of Chinese pottery that looked far older than the Ming Dynasty replicas they were labeled as. But it was what we found in the third-floor storage room that changed everything. These trunks haven't been opened in decades, Tom said, helping me move a heavy wooden chest. The label read, North Africa, 1962. Inside, wrapped in old blankets, we found a collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts. My hands shook as I unwrapped them carefully. These look like they're from the New Kingdom period, I whispered. But that's impossible. These should be in a museum. Tom was reading through some old papers found in the trunk. Here's a letter from 1962, something about an archaeological expedition Grandpa James funded. Legal export papers, permissions from the Egyptian government. He didn't just collect art, I realized. He was a serious antiquities collector, but why didn't he ever display these pieces properly? The answer came 3 days later when Dr. Marcus Way, one of the world's leading art experts, arrived to examine the collection. I'd sent in photographs of just a few pieces, not mentioning their source. His response had been immediate and intense. The moment he walked into the gallery, his professional demeanor cracked. My God, he whispered, moving from piece to piece. Do you understand what you have here? I watched him examine the small landscape I'd noticed. His hands were shaking as he used his specialized light to examine the paint and canvas. This is an unknown early Monet, he confirmed. Probably from his time in Normandy, before Impression, Sunrise. But that's just the beginning. He moved to the bronze sculpture. This Rodin is also authentic, one of his studies for the thinker. And these pottery pieces, he carefully lifted one of the Chinese vases, Ming Dynasty, but not replicas, originals. My head was spinning. How much would you estimate the collection is worth? Dr. Wei looked around the gallery, making rapid calculations. Just from what I've seen on the first floor, at least $100 million. If those Egyptian artifacts you mentioned are authentic, possibly much more. At that moment, my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Family meeting tomorrow. Discussing a developer's offer for your gallery property. Don't be difficult about this. I showed the message to Tom, who had sunk into a chair, still processing the revelation about his grandfather's collection. What are you going to do? He asked. I looked around at the treasures James had spent a lifetime collecting, thinking about our conversations, about his belief in looking beyond the obvious. First, I said, we're going to document and authenticate everything properly. Then we're going to turn this gallery into what your grandfather always dreamed it could be. Dr. Y was already making calls to his colleagues, arranging for a full evaluation team. This will shake the art world, he said excitedly. A previously unknown private collection of this magnitude. As I watched the experts begin their work, I thought about tomorrow's family meeting. About Margaret's sneers and Richard's condescension. About how they dismissed this inheritance as worthless, just as they dismissed my art history degree. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right, and sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to truly see them. The Montgomery family's private conference room hadn't changed since I first entered it 10 years ago as Tom's fiancé. The same oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, silently judging every decision made beneath them. Richard sat at the head of the table, Grandpa James' old spot, while Margaret held court at his right hand. We've received an offer from Platinum Development Group, Richard announced without preamble. $5 million for the gallery property. Given the location and condition, it's more than generous. I placed my folder on the mahogany table, taking my time. That is generous, I agreed, but I'm afraid we'll have to decline. Margaret's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table. Don't be foolish, Emma. That building is eating up money in maintenance costs. The art inside isn't worth a fraction of this offer. Actually, I said, opening my folder. About that art, I began laying out photographs and preliminary authentication reports. Dr. Marcus Way and his team have spent the past week evaluating the collection. Would you like to know what they found? Richard barely glanced at the documents. Some old paintings and dusty antiques. What's your point? My point is that the worthless collection you've been mocking includes an unknown early Monet, an original Rodin study, authentic Ming Dynasty pottery, and a legally exported collection of New Kingdom Egyptian artifacts. I slid the preliminary valuation across the table. Current estimated value, approximately $300 million, and they're still cataloging the second floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's face had gone pale. Richard picked up the valuation with trembling hands. That's impossible, he stammered. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, it's probably conservative. Dr. White entered, followed by his colleague Dr. Sarah Chen from the National Gallery. We just finished our preliminary assessment of the second floor collections. The Japanese prints alone are worth $20 million. I watched as the family's expressions shifted from dismissal to disbelief to dawning comprehension. Tom, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Grandpa James didn't just leave us a building, he said. He left us a legacy, one that only Emma was patient enough to understand. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. The Montgomery Collection, as we're proposing to call it, represents one of the most significant private art collections to emerge in decades. The range, the quality, the historical significance. She spread out more photographs on the table. These pieces tell the story of human creativity across centuries and continents. We're offering our full support to establish this as a proper museum, Dr. Wei added. The art world is already buzzing with the news. Several major institutions have expressed interest in collaboration. Richard's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Now wait just a minute. If this collection is worth that much, surely the family should have a say in its disposition. Perhaps we should consider selling to private collectors. Actually, I interrupted, pulling out another document. Grandpa James was very clear about that. I read from his private letter to me, found in the gallery's safe. This collection was built not just for its monetary value, but for the stories it tells about human achievement. It belongs to the world, not to private vaults. Emma will understand this. Margaret's lips thinned. You knew about this all along. Those afternoons you spent with James. I knew he was a brilliant collector, I said. But even I didn't understand the full scope until now. What I did understand was his vision, to create something lasting, something that would enrich people's lives. Over the next few hours, we outlined our plans for the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. The Victorian building would be carefully restored, its original features preserved while being upgraded to modern museum standards. The surrounding area, far from being dying, would be revitalized by the museum's presence. 6 months later, I stood in the restored main gallery, watching as the final preparations were made for our grand opening. The space had been transformed. State-of-the-art security and climate control systems protected the priceless artifacts. Each piece had been carefully researched, its story ready to be shared with the world. The town had changed too. New cafes and shops had opened nearby. Hotels were being built to accommodate the expected tourists. Property values, including Richard's precious real estate holdings, had skyrocketed. Mrs. Chen Montgomery, a young intern, approached with a tablet. The Times wants to know if you'll comment on the Montgomery collection being named one of the most important art discoveries of the decade. Before I could answer, I heard familiar footsteps. Margaret stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but determined. I want to help, she said quietly. With the museum. I've been taking some art history classes online, and she gestured helplessly at the magnificence around us. I want to understand what James saw, what you see. I smiled, remembering all those dismissive comments about my worthless degree. We're starting a docent training program. Would you like to join? The grand opening attracted art lovers and critics from around the world. Richard and his developer friends watched in amazement as thousands of visitors lined up to see the collection. Tom stood proudly by my side as I gave interviews about his grandfather's legacy. But my favorite moment came later, during a special evening tour for local students. A teenage girl stood transfixed before the early Monet, her eyes wide with wonder. How did he see it? She asked me. How did your grandfather-in-law know these pieces were special when everyone else missed them? I thought about James's words during our afternoon talks. True value isn't in what everyone else sees, Emma. It's in having the patience to look deeper, to understand the stories behind things. He knew how to look beyond the surface, I told her. And he trusted that someday someone else would too. The Montgomery Museum became more than just a collection of valuable art. It became a center for education, offering programs for students of all ages. The conservation department attracted experts from around the world. The research library, named in James's honor, became a vital resource for art historians. Richard eventually came around, especially after realizing how the museum's presence had transformed his real estate investments. He even donated one of those stern ancestral portraits to our historical collection, though I suspect that was more about tax benefits than reconciliation. Margaret threw herself into her docent training with surprising enthusiasm. Watching her explain the significance of Ming Dynasty pottery to visitors, her face alight with genuine interest, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about proving others wrong. It's about opening their eyes to what they've been missing. Last week, I found a letter while organizing James' papers, written shortly before his death. It read, "Dear Emma, by now you've discovered what I've always known. That value isn't just in what can be bought and sold, but in what can be understood and shared. This collection needed someone who could see beyond price tags to the human stories behind each piece. Thank you for being that person. Love, Grandpa James." As I write this from my office overlooking the restored gallery, watching visitors discover their own connections to art and history, I'm reminded that inheritance isn't just about what we receive. It's about what we choose to do with it. The art world still buzzes about the miraculous Montgomery discovery, but I know there was no miracle. There was just an old man who spent his life collecting stories in physical form, and a granddaughter-in-law who took the time to understand why. Sometimes the most valuable things are dismissed as worthless by those too impatient to look deeper. And sometimes the person they underestimate turns out to be the one who understands the true worth of things all along. The museum continues to grow, each new day bringing fresh discoveries and connections. In the end, we didn't just preserve a collection. We fulfilled a vision, one that transformed not just a family's understanding of value, but an entire community's appreciation of art and history. And that, as Grandpa James would say, is worth more than all the real estate in the world.